Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we must journey into one of the darkest corners of human depravity, a case that is not only a chronicle of serial murder, but a terrifying exploration of how a monster can be both brazenly visible and simultaneously invisible within the cracks of society. We are going to undertake the complete, meticulous, and extensive examination of Joseph Roy Metheny, a man whose immense physical size earned him the unsettling nickname Tiny, and whose self-confessed atrocities, both proven and rumored, continue to define a pinnacle of modern horror. This is a story that requires us to look beyond the sensational headlines and deeply into the lives lost, the police failures, the legal complexities, and the social context that allowed a killer to thrive for years in the heart of an American city. It is a long journey, so settle in, because the details of Joseph Metheny's life and crimes are both exhaustive and profoundly disturbing. Joseph Roy Metheny was born on March 2nd, 1955, in the industrial, working-class city of Baltimore, Maryland. The eventual stage for his crimes was a harsh urban environment, but the roots of his monstrous nature were already planted deep in a childhood marked by conflicting narratives of stability and neglect. Understanding Metheny requires wading through these two competing, deeply personal accounts of his formative years. In the narrative Metheny constructed for his attorneys and the courts later in life, a narrative often employed to mitigate or explain his actions, he painted a picture of early, profound abandonment. He claimed his childhood was plagued by instability and emotional deprivation. His father, he said, was a heavy alcoholic whose life was cut short in a car accident when Joseph was just 6 years old. Following this tragedy, Metheny asserted that his mother, already working tirelessly to support 6 children, was forced to constantly shift him and his siblings into the homes of other families. He described this as a foster-like existence, a continuous cycle of being shunted from one temporary residence to another, fostering in him an entrenched sense of being unwanted, unanchored, and deeply traumatized. For Metheny, this was the foundational trauma, the source of the overwhelming rage he would unleash decades later. However, the reality of Metheny's early life, as recollected by his own mother, stood in stark and direct contrast to this self-pitying account. Metheny's mother adamantly refuted the claims of outright neglect. She acknowledged, with clarity and sorrow, that their family was deeply impoverished, forcing her to work relentlessly at multiple jobs simply to keep them afloat. Yet, she maintained a strong defense of her parenting, insisting that her children were never truly placed in the homes of strangers, nor did they ever go hungry. She countered the idea of him being a troubled child, recalling the young Joseph as an above-average student who was polite and well-behaved. In her view, the disintegration of his character, the development of the mean person he ultimately became, was not the result of early trauma, but a tragic independent path that began when he succumbed to the destructive world of drug abuse. The truth, as it often does, likely resides in the complex space between these two versions. A life certainly constrained by poverty and the early loss of a parent, providing a fertile emotional ground for the later, more damaging choices Metheny himself made. In 1973, at the age of 18, Metheny sought a definitive break from his troubled Baltimore environment by enlisting in the United States Army. His mother confirmed he served time in Germany. This military service A brief attempt at structure and discipline offered a temporary detour from his eventual path. Yet, even this relatively brief period of service became contaminated by Metheny's later compulsion to fabricate and exaggerate his persona. In various self-aggrandizing interviews, Metheny would claim to have been an artillery unit veteran in Vietnam, a historical impossibility given the timeline of American withdrawal. His mother had no recollection of him serving in that war, and these claims were quickly dismissed as elements of the exaggerated, terrifying myth he was actively constructing around himself. The military experience, whatever its reality, did not provide a permanent fix. After his service, Metheny's contact with his family dwindled to almost nothing, marking the start of his long, deliberate drift into Baltimore's criminal and addictive underbelly. By the 1990s, the physical transformation of Joseph Metheny was complete, giving rise to his ironic moniker. He stood a commanding 6 feet, 1 inch tall, and was severely, massively obese. The name Tiny was a dark, satirical joke among those who knew him, emphasizing his unbelievable physical bulk. This massive size would become a crucial element of his predatory strategy, allowing him to easily overpower the smaller, often drug-weakened victims he targeted. Despite his increasingly chaotic private life, Metheny managed to maintain a fragile external stability. He was employed as a forklift driver, a seemingly normal functional role that provided him with a steady income. But every cent of that income was quickly channeled back into his devastating addictions. The relentless consumption of crack cocaine, heroin, and liquor. His addiction forced him to exist on the margins, often sleeping in the same makeshift tent cities and transient camps as the desperate, vulnerable population he would eventually begin to hunt. This was the terrifying duality of Joseph Metheny, the functioning, articulate forklift driver by day, and the deeply entrenched, raging addict by night, a man whose internal landscape was a volcano of unaddressed trauma and drug-fueled fury, desperately seeking an outlet. It was a life teetering on a razor's edge, and the slightest tremor was all it would take to send him plunging into open, unbridled violence. The environment was set, the rage was primed, and the inevitable explosion was merely a matter of time and a trigger. That trigger, as it turned out, was deeply personal and rooted in the very relationships he claimed to crave, but inevitably destroyed. The definitive psychological fracture that transformed Joseph Metheny from a severely troubled individual into a serial killer was a deeply personal event, that abandonment by his family. This moment served as the singular, catastrophic trigger, the point where his internal rage, fueled by years of addiction and what he perceived as childhood trauma, finally burst its bounds and became external, homicidal fury. In 1995, Metheny was living with his girlfriend, the mother of his 6-year-old son. Their shared existence was volatile, anchored, like Metheny's, in the world of drug addiction. When his girlfriend made the painful decision to leave him, taking their young son with her, the emotional blow was devastating. Metheny perceived this departure not just as the end of a relationship, but as a direct, painful reenactment of the abandonment he claimed to have suffered as a child. The loss of his son and the woman he was with ignited a murderous, misdirected rage. He didn't blame his partner for leaving, nor did he blame himself for the chaos of their life. Instead, his fury fixated entirely on the drug dealers. In his twisted logic, It was the drug dealers who had provided the substances, corrupted his life, and ultimately were responsible for separating him from his child and his semblance of a family unit. Metheny immediately became consumed by an obsessive desire for vengeance against these dealers. His subsequent manhunt led him directly into the most desolate and neglected areas of South Baltimore, the tent cities clustered beneath the massive structure of the Hanover Street Bridge. This locale was a known chaotic hub for drug transactions and the transient community, a place where people lived off the grid and where the eyes of official authority rarely lingered. It was the perfect anonymous theater for Metheny's first acts of unbridled murder. What unfolded next, however, was a tragic and indiscriminate act of misdirected violence. Metheny's victims were not the specific drug dealers he sought, but simply men caught in the indiscriminate path of his destructive fury. In August 1995, Metheny was tried for the alleged savage axe murders of two homeless men, Randall Brewer and Randy Piker. The complexity of the violence in these transient camps presented a formidable challenge to the legal system. The bodies of Brewer and Piker were discovered on August 2nd, 1995, tragically on the same day that a third homeless man, Everett Dowell, was also murdered. The subsequent investigation became hopelessly muddled by the sheer chaos of the environment. One key piece of evidence, the axe allegedly used to kill Dowell, was stolen by another homeless man, Larry Amos, who was later convicted of manslaughter for Dowell's death. The lack of reliable witness testimony from the drug-addled and transient community, coupled with the critical failure to secure and maintain forensic evidence related to the weapon, led to a catastrophic failure of justice in the Metheny case. In July 1996, the jury considering the murders of Brewer and Piker was forced to conclude that there was insufficient evidence to definitively convict Joseph Metheny. He was acquitted of their murders. This acquittal was not a moment of justice, but a catastrophic release. Metheny was a proven, self-confessed menace who had already ended two lives, yet the legal system was forced to grant him his freedom. The terrifying irony is that Metheny himself would later explicitly confess to the murders of both Brewer and Piker, removing all doubt that the jury had let a killer walk free. This failure served as a grim validation for Metheny. It proved to him that if he chose his next targets correctly, individuals who were even more isolated, marginalized, and unlikely to be immediately missed, he could truly kill with impunity. In the wake of this acquittal, Metheny's predatory focus became sharper, more cold-blooded, and terrifyingly efficient. His target population shifted to young white women in the Baltimore area who struggled with drug addiction, particularly those involved in sex work who frequented the bars and streets around Washington Boulevard. These women, in Metheny's eyes, were the most vulnerable prey, individuals whose disappearance would not likely trigger an immediate, aggressive missing persons investigation. This sharpened focus led him to the location that would become his personal, inescapable fortress of murder. Metheny was employed as a forklift driver at the Joe Stein and Son Pallet Company, a massive desolate industrial site located in the 3200 block of James Street in southwest Baltimore. The property was enormous, enclosed by an 8-foot high chain link fence topped with barbed wire, creating a literal, isolated compound. Crucially, Metheny lived in a secluded, one-room trailer situated on the property's south fence line. The entire area was deserted after the workday ended. lying on a dead-end street with virtually no foot traffic. The stacks of wooden pallets, towering and ubiquitous, created a perfect maze of shadows and concealment. This factory, this island of industrial anonymity, became the stage for the climax of his violence and the final resting place for his confirmed victims. His release after the Hanover Bridge murders did not lead to repentance. It led to escalation, focusing his attention on this perfect, isolated hunting ground. The choice of location for Joseph Metheny's confirmed murders was not accidental. It was a meticulous, cold-blooded selection that leveraged the urban blight and industrial anonymity of Baltimore to create a perfect, impenetrable fortress of isolation. The Joe Stein and Son Pallet Company, situated in the 3200 block of James Street in southwest Baltimore, was more than just his workplace. It was the essential, enabling element of his serial violence. The sheer physical layout of the property was an accomplice to his crimes. The company specialized in wooden pallets, meaning the entire expansive yard, which covered roughly a city block, was cluttered with immense, towering stacks of wood. These stacks created a chaotic, multi-layered landscape of shadows, blind spots, and mazes that could easily conceal activities, movement, and, most chillingly, human remains. Further enhancing this isolation was the security surrounding the compound. The entire perimeter was secured by a rigid 8-foot-high chain link fence, its top crowned with glinting barbed wire. This barrier served two crucial functions. It kept unwanted eyes and potential witnesses out, and it ensured that Metheny's victims, once inside, had no hope of easily escaping. It was a prison designed by the killer himself. At the heart of this compound, along the south fence line, sat Metheny's primary residence, a small, isolated one-room trailer. This trailer was his lair, a private space where he could bring his victims without fear of observation. Once the workday ended, the entire industrial block became completely deserted. The factory was located on a dead-end street, ensuring that after 5 o'clock, there was virtually no vehicular or pedestrian traffic, sealing the compound in a heavy, insulating silence. It was the geographical equivalent of falling off the map, a place where a scream would be absorbed by the towering stacks of wood and never reach a neighbor's ear. This environment was perfectly matched to his predatory strategy. Metheny's new hunting ground was the main artery nearby, Washington Boulevard. This street and the surrounding area were frequented by the vulnerable population he had decided to target. Young, white women struggling with severe drug addiction, often involved in sex work to support their habits. Metheny knew the desperation of this community. He was an addict himself, often living in the same transient encampments. He knew exactly what these women were seeking: a temporary respite, a promise of a fix, or a safe place to use. Metheny would use the promise of drugs, a shared dose of crack or heroin, to lure them away from the public street and into his isolation. The massive size of the man, the 6'1", severely obese figure, combined with the lure of narcotics, was usually enough to convince a desperate, drug-weakened woman to accept a ride. Once they arrived at the Joe Stein and Son Pallet Company, the fortress effect took hold. They were behind the fence, surrounded by the labyrinth of wood, and miles from any chance of a witness or intervention. The isolated trailer was the final cage. The significance of the location also extended to the disposal of evidence. Metheny's job granted him access and plausible deniability to be on the property at all hours. He could use the wooded areas adjacent to the property, or even the ground directly beneath his trailer, to bury, hide, and later disturb the remains of his victims, knowing that the industrial traffic and the presence of the fence would deter casual observation or even thorough initial searches. The setting, therefore, is not a passive detail in the Metheny story. It is an active, enabling accomplice to his most heinous crimes: the murders of Kathy Ann Magaziner in 1994, Kimberly Lynn Spicer in 1996, and the terrifying attempted assault and kidnapping of Rita Kemper in December 1996. Without the perfect industrial isolation of the Joe Stein and Son Pallet Company, Joseph Metheny's self-admitted spree would have been far more difficult, perhaps even impossible, to sustain for as long as he did. The environment protected the monster, enabling him to prey on those whom society had already, tragically, forgotten. The case of Kathy Ann Magaziner is perhaps the most heartbreakingly illustrative of Joseph Metheny's predatory pattern, representing a cold-blooded murder committed well over a year before his more famous spree began, and demonstrating the chilling foresight and control he exercised. Metheny confessed to murdering Kathy Magaziner in July 1994, revealing a dark prelude to his later confirmed violence. Kathy Magaziner's life, tragically, is largely defined by the details a killer remembered and relayed to the police, highlighting the invisibility of the vulnerable population Metheny targeted. Metheny recalled her as being a thinner, taller woman with brunette hair. Crucially, he remembered that she was missing a couple of upper front teeth, a chillingly precise physical detail that provided necessary confirmation of her identity when her remains were finally recovered. Though sources are inconsistent on her exact age, placing her around 45 at the time of her disappearance, she was a woman struggling with addiction, making her susceptible to Metheny's lure of drugs and shelter. Metheny claimed he encountered Kathy one night in July 1994, specifically recalling a date near the 4th of July holiday. Using his standard tactic, the promise of drugs and temporary sanctuary, he persuaded her to return with him to his isolated one-room trailer on the grounds of the Joe Stein and Son Pallet Company. Once she was behind the barbed wire fence and surrounded by the immense stacks of wood, Kathy was completely at Metheny's mercy, sealed off from the outside world. The murder was not an act of chaotic frenzy, but a calculated, brutal exercise in control, committed approximately an hour after their arrival. Metheny first began to strangle Kathy with his hands. Then, with a chilling degree of premeditation, he moved to a more permanent method. He retrieved an extension cord. He wrapped the cord around her neck, tightening it until she was completely unconscious. He then finished the strangulation with the cord, ensuring the final, devastating cessation of her life. In a chilling demonstration of his secondary motives, the desire to degrade and rob, Metheny immediately followed the murder by robbing her, taking her purse and clothing. The act of theft was not his primary motive, but a callous final insult, a legal distinction that would later become critical to his sentencing fate. Metheny then dragged her lifeless body into the densely wooded area adjacent to the pallet factory, where he attempted to conceal his crime by digging a shallow grave, roughly 2 feet deep. He buried her there, unclothed, leaving her remains to the mercy of the elements and the isolated terrain. However, the tragedy of Kathy Ann Magaziner did not conclude with her burial. It was compounded by an act of profound, almost unbelievable desecration 6 months later. In a stunning display of psychological detachment and macabre control, Metheny confessed to returning to Kathy's shallow grave in approximately January 1995. He claimed he dug up her skeletal remains, specifically removing her skull. He then disposed of her cranium by throwing it into a trash box. The remaining skeletal fragments were left scattered and disturbed within the original grave. This act, disturbing the remains of his own victim, was a final, grotesque attempt to ensure her permanent anonymity and silence. By removing the skull, he believed he was eliminating the most identifying feature of the human body, the one part that forensic science often uses to reconstruct identity and image. Kathy Magaziner's remains remained hidden for over 2 years. They were only discovered in late 1996 because Metheny, after his arrest for the later murder of Kimberly Spicer, led investigators back to the factory property. The terrain was treacherous, complicated by rain drainage, making the search difficult. But the persistent work of the forensic team, including renowned anthropologist Dr. William C. Rodriguez III, finally unearthed the tragic truth. The discovery was a grim confirmation of Metheny's chilling story. The forensic team found the fragmented, disturbed skeletal remains in the shallow grave, exactly as the killer had described. The bones were consistent with an adult Caucasian female. Crucially, and confirming Metheny's grotesque detail, the cranium was indeed missing. The arrangement of the remaining bones clearly indicated the body had been significantly disturbed months after burial. The identification of Catherine Magaziner finally closed a 2-year missing persons case, converting a cold file into a confirmed murder conviction. A tragedy spanning from a brutal strangulation to a post-mortem desecration stands as a horrific testament to the sheer, calculated depravity of Joseph Metheny, a monster who sought not only to end life, but to utterly erase identity. The murderess of Kimberly Lynn Spicer is the second confirmed, prosecutable murder for which Joseph Metheny was convicted, and it holds the unique, inverted significance of being the specific act that ultimately ended his career as a predator. Where Kathy Ann Magaziner's case remained a secret for over 2 years, Kimberly Spicer's tragedy resulted in a tip-off that brought the full, terrifying weight of the law down upon Metheny within a single month. Kimberly Lynn Spicer, a young woman whose life was tragically compromised by the cycle of addiction, was either 23 or 26 at the time of her death in mid-November 1996. Like Magaziner, she was part of the marginalized population Metheny specifically targeted, vulnerable, reliant on the drug scene of Washington Boulevard, and unlikely to be immediately reported missing with the requisite urgency. The encounter followed Metheny's chillingly successful pattern. He lured her to his trailer at the desolate Joe Stein & Son Pallet Company on the promise of drugs. Once inside the secluded fortress, Metheny's control was absolute. The murder of Kimberly Spicer was quick, brutal, and lethal, carried out not by strangulation, but by stabbing her with a knife. The violence was immediate and irreversible, ensuring her silence within the confines of his isolated lair. Following the murder, Metheny faced the immediate logistical challenge of disposal. He concealed Kimberly's body at the factory site, likely intending to either process the remains, as he later infamously claimed, or to find a more permanent, distant burial location. The towering stacks of pallets and the fenced perimeter offered him the concealment he needed to buy time. However, the month-long concealment was abruptly interrupted by a crucial, catastrophic error on Metheny's part. He became reckless, perhaps under the influence of drugs, or simply overwhelmed by the physical difficulty of disposing of a massive body. In early December 1996, Metheny made the fatal decision to ask a friend for assistance in burying Kimberly's body, which was still concealed at the factory site. The friend, suddenly confronted with the raw, undeniable horror of a killer's confession and the physical reality of a body, exhibited remarkable courage and integrity. They immediately went to the authorities. This courageous decision set off an immediate and decisive police investigation. Officers quickly moved on the Joe Stein and Son Pallet Company property. On December 15th, 1996, police discovered the body of Kimberly Spicer. Her remains were found tragically close, buried directly beneath the trailer where Metheny lived. This discovery was the irrefutable, undeniable physical evidence that the police had lacked in the murky chaos of the 1995 Hanover Street Bridge murders. The police operation was swift and conclusive. Later that same day, Joseph Metheny was arrested and formally charged with Kimberly's murder. The investigation did not stop there. In a demonstration of the seriousness of the charges, the owner of the pallet company was also arrested as he and Metheny were leaving a Christmas party, charged as an accessory after the fact for allegedly aiding in the disposal of evidence. Kimberly Spicer's tragic case was the catalyst of closure for the Metheny investigation. Her murder, discovered through an informant, brought Metheny's reign to an abrupt end, and more importantly, forced the monster to reveal his full scope of violence during his subsequent confession. Once in custody, Metheny waived his rights and began to talk. His confession did not stop with the knife murder of Kimberly. It escalated quickly to include the far older, cold case of Kathy Ann Magaziner, leading police to the correct location of her partially dismembered remains. Kimberly Lynn Spicer's life was taken with cold-blooded brutality, but the circumstances of her discovery ensured that her killer would face justice. The horror of her final moments led directly to the truth of Kathy Ann Magaziner's disappearance and, crucially, protected countless other vulnerable women in Baltimore from suffering the same tragic fate. Her discovery provided the legal evidence and the psychological shock required to finally silence one of the city's most destructive predators. The confirmed reality of Joseph Metheny's violence rests on the murders of Kathy Ann Magaziner and Kimberly Lynn Spicer, and the violent attempted assault on Rita Kemper. However, Metheny was never satisfied with this limited tally. He was a relentless self-promoter of his depravity, spinning a wider, darker web in his confessions, claiming to have killed as many as 13 people over a 2-decade span, dating back as early as 1976. This vast gulf between confirmed convictions and self-admitted atrocities leaves a dark, unresolved dimension to his story. The unconfirmed victims fall into two major categories: those who are known to the system but unprosecutable, and those who simply vanished into the vastness of the Baltimore waterways. The first category involves individuals Metheny explicitly named, yet for whom the legal system could not secure a conviction. Randall Brewer and Randy Piker, the axe murders of these two homeless men beneath the Hanover Street Bridge in August 1995, were a product of Metheny's initial rage following his abandonment. Despite Metheny's later full confession of their murders, the initial trial resulted in an acquittal due to the chaotic crime scene, The lack of reliable evidence and the confusing sequence of other deaths in the transient camp. Metheny's confession confirmed the reality of their fate, yet the law was unable to hold him accountable for these two specific lives. Tony Lynn in Gracia. This case is particularly haunting because the investigation came so close to a third conviction. Tony Lynn in Gracia, 28 years old, was another vulnerable woman Metheny confessed to murdering. Metheny was officially indicted for her murder based on the strength of his confession. However, in a painful outcome for her family and investigators, these charges were ultimately dropped due to a lack of sufficient corroborating evidence. Whether her body was never recovered or the forensic link was too weak remains shrouded, but Gracia stands as a testament to the frustrating limits of prosecuting a killer whose primary evidence is his own testimony. The second, most terrifying category involves the claims that stretch the scope of Metheny's crimes beyond the confines of the pallet factory and the Hanover Bridge. The three other prostitutes he allegedly murdered along Washington Boulevard. Metheny's method of disposal for these women was deliberately chosen for its capacity to ensure permanent anonymity. He claimed he had weighed their bodies down with rocks and then threw them into the Patapsco River. The Patapsco River, a major waterway flowing through Baltimore and into the massive Chesapeake Bay, is a perfect natural hiding place. Its deep, cold, silty bed, combined with the immense volume of water and the powerful, shifting currents, would quickly degrade and carry away human remains, effectively concealing all forensic evidence. Metheny, with his intimate knowledge of the city's industrial waterfront, understood this dynamic perfectly. He was relying on the certainty that the river would never give up its secrets. Despite police searches conducted based on his confessions, no bodies were ever recovered to confirm these claims. Why did Metheny confess to so much more than he could be convicted for? This remains a critical area of psychological and narrative analysis. The craving for infamy. Metheny was a relentless self-aggrandizer, a massive imposing figure who sought to transcend the pathetic reality of his existence as an isolated forklift driver. By confessing to over a dozen murders and adding the grotesque, unverified claim of cannibalism, he was actively inflating his own legend. He wanted to be remembered not as a common killer, but as a mythical, terrifying monster. A final act of control. By confessing to the river disposals, Metheny achieved a final, psychological form of control over the victims' families. They would forever know that he killed their loved one, but they would never have the comfort of a body, a grave, or a definitive resolution. Their uncertainty became his enduring power. The legal system was forced to focus exclusively on the two cases where the physical evidence, the bodies of Magaziner and Spicer, was undeniable. The rest of Joseph Metheny's claimed body count remains submerged, literally and figuratively, in the dark, cold waters of the Patapsco River, a final, unprosecutable testament to the full, terrifying scope of his malice. His unconfirmed victims are a silent, haunting legacy, a shadow of death that forever darkens the criminal history of Baltimore. The name, the Cannibal Killer, is inextricably linked to Joseph Metheny's narrative, a headline-grabbing moniker that permanently cemented his position in the hierarchy of American horror. This reputation is based almost entirely on a series of grotesque, self-proclaimed actions that Metheny boasted about during his confession and later interviews. The claim that he butchered his victims, consumed their flesh, and sold it to unsuspecting customers at a makeshift barbecue stand. To understand the Metheny case fully, we must perform a detailed, meticulous deconstruction of this claim, separating the proven, canonical facts from the monster's obvious desire to terrorize and dominate. Metheny's account of his cannibalistic activities was offered with chilling, clinical detail. He claimed that after murdering and dismembering some of his victims, including Kathy Ann Magaziner and Kimberly Spicer, he would take their flesh and store it. Preparation and storage. He stated that he would cut up the human flesh, place it into Tupperware bowls, and then store these containers in a freezer. The barbecue stand. The next step in his grotesque production line, he claimed, was the operation of an open-pit beef stand. This was allegedly set up near the desolate Ballot factory on James Street, a prime location for industrial workers who might stop for a quick lunch. The mix. The most stomach-turning detail was the alleged composition of his sandwiches. He claimed he would mix the human flesh with traditional beef and pork, cooking it slowly over the open pit. The taste test. In a statement designed to produce maximum psychological impact, Metheny offered his assessment of the product. The human body taste was very similar to pork. If you mix it together, no one can tell the difference. He told investigators, and later the court. He even added a chilling, macabre marketing line. I had real roast beef and pork sandwiches. They were very good. The sheer horror of the claim quickly spread through the media, defining the Metheny case. However, when police and prosecutors followed up on this horrific aspect of his confession, the evidence simply did not exist to corroborate the story. Lack of physical confirmation. The exhaustive, meticulous search of the Joe Stein and Son Pallet Company, Metheny's trailer, and the surrounding areas, including the excavation of remains, yielded no verifiable physical evidence of a working roadside barbecue stand. There were no remnants of a pit, no customer receipts, and no forensic evidence of human processing on the scale required to operate a public stand. Forensic limitations. While human remains were recovered, the primary focus of the forensic analysis was to confirm the victims' identities and the cause and manner of their deaths, not to track evidence of consumption. No forensic team was able to provide conclusive, irrefutable evidence that Metheny had engaged in the consumption or sale of human flesh. The legal posture of the case reflects this void. Metheny was convicted of the murders of Kathy Ann Magaziner and Kimberly Lynn Spicer, the attempted murder of Rita Kemper, and the robbery of Magaziner. But the official, canonical convictions do not include any charges or convictions related to cannibalism or desecration for consumption. The court was forced to proceed solely on the evidence of homicide, which was overwhelming, and to set aside the cannibalism as an unverified, sensationalized element of the killer's testimony. Speculation. The most logical conclusion is that Joseph Metheny, the massive man who sought ultimate control and attention, fabricated or grossly exaggerated this aspect of his crimes. He understood the media's hunger for sensationalism and recognized that a simple serial killer is quickly forgotten, but a cannibal killer who served his victims to the public achieves a terrifying, eternal infamy. The claim was a final chilling act of psychological terrorism aimed not just at the families of his victims, but at the entire community of Baltimore, leaving them with the haunting, unshakable question of what they may have unknowingly consumed. The case of Joseph Metheny is therefore a profound study in narrative control. The reality of his crimes was brutal, but the legend of his crimes, built on his unverified confession, is what truly solidified his terrifying place in true crime history. The truth remains buried in the silence of his final prison days, but the unsettling image of the roadside barbecue is an enduring legacy of his monstrous persona. Joseph Metheny's reign of murder and horror ended not by a cold case breakthrough, nor by a complex forensic investigation, but by the sheer, desperate courage of a woman named Rita Kemper. Her assault in December 1996 and her subsequent immediate report to the police was the direct catalyst that led to Metheny's arrest and the eventual discovery of Kimberly Spicer's body. The sequence of events involving Rita Kemper took place on December 8, 1996, a mere 3 weeks after Metheny had murdered Kimberly Spicer. Metheny was, by this time, deeply entrenched in his routine, relying on the predictable desperation of his target population and the isolation of his pallet factory lair. Like his previous victims, Rita Kemper was a young, vulnerable woman struggling with addiction, whom Metheny encountered in his regular hunting ground near Washington Boulevard. He successfully lured her back to his isolated trailer at the Joe Stein and Son Pallet Company with the promise of crack cocaine, a shared dose to relax her and facilitate his plan for sexual violence. The situation escalated violently when Kemper, once inside the confines of the trailer, refused Metheny's advances and attempts to engage in sexual activity. Metheny, whose self-control was virtually non-existent and whose addiction amplified his already immense rage, immediately flew into a violent fury at this unexpected rejection. The immense physical difference between the severely obese 6'1" Metheny and the smaller, drug-weakened Kemper made the ensuing struggle terrifyingly one-sided. The struggle and beating. Kemper attempted to flee, rushing out of the trailer, but Metheny easily captured her, dragging her back into his lair. He subjected her to a brutal beating before attempting to rape her, pulling down her pants in the frenzy. The fateful threat. In the height of the struggle, Metheny, boasting and desperate to gain control through sheer terror, uttered the words that would later provide the essential legal evidence of his pattern. "I'm going to kill you and bury you in the woods with the other girls." This was more than a threat. It was a chilling, explicit, and legally crucial admission of a pre-existing pattern of murder. Against all odds, Rita Kemper managed to achieve the impossible. She escaped. Her sheer will to survive, fueled by the terrifying reality of his words, propelled her out of the trailer and away from the isolated compound. Crucially, Kemper did not hesitate. Despite the trauma, the beating, and the fear, she immediately fled to local police officers and reported the attempted assault and kidnapping, recounting the full horror of her encounter and, most importantly, identifying the location and the man who had threatened her life. Kemper's report initiated the final, decisive phase of the investigation. Her testimony, combined with the earlier tip from the friend Metheny had asked to help with Kimberly Spicer's burial, gave police everything they needed: a credible, living victim and a confirmed body disposal. The immediate impact of Kemper's escape and report was swift and absolute. Immediate focus. The Baltimore Police Department and the FBI task force focused immediately on the Joe Stein and Son Pallet Company. The final discovery. The police acted on the information regarding Kimberly Spicer, leading to Metheny's arrest on December 15, 1996. and the discovery of Spicer's body buried beneath his trailer. The confession trigger, Metheny's arrest for the Spicer murder, coupled with the clear path to proving the Kemper assault, forced his compliance, leading to his full, unbridled confession that finally revealed the fate of Kathy Ann Magaziner. Rita Kemper's courageous decision to come forward, despite her trauma and the immense vulnerability of her situation, transformed the Metheny case from a series of cold, isolated disappearances into a prosecutable serial murder case. Her survival and her powerful, explicit testimony detailing Metheny's pattern of violence and his boastful words provided the legal leverage necessary to secure Metheny's convictions and ensure his permanent confinement. She was the hero who finally closed the trap on the man who had vowed to bury her with the other girls. The arrest and subsequent confession of Joseph Metheny on December 15th, 1996, transformed the Baltimore Police Department's cold case files into a massive, multifaceted criminal prosecution. The legal proceedings spanned years, focusing on the three undeniable pillars of evidence: the survival and testimony of Rita Kemper, and the bodies of Kimberly Lynn Spicer and Kathy Ann Magaziner. The prosecution, in an attempt to seek the maximum penalty, navigated three distinct trials and sentencing procedures, which resulted in a complex and ultimately mixed verdict. The first case, brought to trial, was the one that led directly to his capture: the assault and kidnapping of Rita Kemper. The charges: Metheny faced charges of kidnapping, attempted sexual assault, and attempted murder. The evidence: the prosecution relied heavily on Kemper's powerful, harrowing testimony. She recounted the events of December 8, 1996, detailing the lure of drugs, the brutal beating after her refusal, the attempted rape, and, most critically, Metheny's boastful threat about killing her and burying her with his other victims. This threat not only corroborated her claims, but was used to establish Metheny's predatory pattern for the jury. The verdict: in a mixed decision, the jury found Metheny guilty of kidnapping and attempted sexual assault. He was sentenced to a substantial 50 years in prison for these crimes. However, in a confusing legal outcome, the jury acquitted him of the attempted murder charge. This acquittal did not negate the violence, but it did suggest the difficulty of proving the legal definition of intent to kill beyond a reasonable doubt, even in the face of the chilling threat he made. The core of the prosecution's death penalty case rested on the murder of Kimberly Lynn Spicer, for whom the physical evidence was undeniable. Her body was found buried under the killer's residence. The conviction: the trial established Metheny's guilt conclusively, resulting in a conviction for murder. The sentencing phase. The sentencing phase was arguably the most damning and chilling moment of all the proceedings. The prosecution sought the death penalty by arguing the existence of a specific statutory aggravating circumstance under Maryland law: that the murder was committed during the commission of a robbery. The evidence was that Metheny had taken Kimberly's belongings after he stabbed her. Metheny's testimony. During this phase, Metheny, in an attempt to shock and perhaps to psychologically dominate the courtroom, delivered his infamous testimony of why he killed. He stated with cold clarity that he committed the murders simply because he enjoyed it, that he got a rush out of it, got a high out of it, and had no real excuse why other than "I like to do it." The verdict: the jury, confronted with the irrefutable evidence, the cold-blooded nature of the crime, and the killer's chilling self-admitted pleasure in murder, returned a sentence of death. Metheny was officially moved to Maryland's death row. The prosecution also pursued the murder charge for Kathy Ann Magaziner, whose skeletal remains had been recovered based on Metheny's detailed confession. The guilty plea. In August 1998, Metheny entered a formal plea of guilty to the first-degree premeditated murder of Kathy Ann Magaziner, as well as the accompanying charge of robbery. By pleading guilty, he legally admitted to the precise, brutal details: the encounter in July 1994, the strangulation with the extension cord, and the subsequent theft of her purse and clothing. The sentence. While the murder was horrific, the sentencing for the Magaziner case resulted in life in prison. The prosecution, having already secured a death sentence in the Spicer case, used this life sentence to solidify his permanent confinement. This mixed sentencing, death for one murder, life for the other, set the stage for the crucial appeal that would determine his ultimate fate. The legal process for Joseph Metheny confirmed his monstrous reality through the rigor of forensic evidence and testimony. He was now a triple convicted violent offender, facing execution, yet his 2 decades of freedom and his unconfirmed body count remained a dark, unprosecutable cloud over the entire saga. The next legal challenge would focus on the narrowest of technicalities: the difference between a murder for robbery and a murder followed by robbery. Despite the dual convictions and the death sentence secured in the Kimberly Spicer case, the legal system in Maryland mandated a rigorous review of all death penalty cases. This mandatory process scrutinized the legal foundation for the sentence, and in the case of Joseph Metheny, this scrutiny ultimately led to the surprising overturn of his death sentence. The entire argument hinged on a narrow, technical distinction: the definition of the statutory aggravating circumstance that made the murder eligible for the death penalty. In Maryland, one such circumstance is that the murder must be committed while the defendant is committing a felony, such as robbery. The prosecution had argued that Metheny took Kimberly Spicer's belongings, meeting the threshold for robbery. In 2001, the Maryland Court of Appeals delivered its verdict on Metheny's appeal, ruling against the death sentence. The legal reasoning: robbery as an afterthought. The court's ruling was based on a meticulous interpretation of the timing and motivation of the crime. Primary motive: the evidence, including Metheny's own confession, strongly indicated that his primary motive for murdering Kimberly Spicer and Kathy Ann Magaziner was not financial gain, but rather a profound, drug-fueled desire for sexual dominance, power, and the rush he openly admitted to craving. The violence was driven by sadism and rage, particularly when his advances were rejected, as in the Kemper case. The timing of the robbery. The court determined that the act of robbery, taking the victim's purse and clothing, was committed after the act of murder. It was an opportunistic afterthought, a toei, callous secondary offense, rather than the primary, motivating factor for the homicide itself. The legal precedent for a murder to qualify for the death penalty, based on the felony murder rule. The court ruled that the murder must be demonstrably committed in furtherance of the robbery, not merely incidentally after the fact. Since Metheny's motive was sadism, not profit, the necessary legal connection was deemed insufficient to support the ultimate penalty. The Court of Appeals thus vacated Metheny's death sentence for the murder of Kimberly Spicer. When the case was remanded back to the trial court for a new sentencing hearing, The death penalty was removed from consideration. His sentence was formally reduced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This ruling had a profound finality. It meant that Joseph Metheny would not face execution, but he would also never again walk free. The life sentence without parole ensured that the man who terrorized Baltimore's vulnerable community would remain confined to the maximum security system until his last breath. For the families, this was a difficult outcome. While the killer would never be released, the revocation of the death sentence, particularly for the murder where the body was found directly beneath his trailer, added a layer of complexity to their sense of closure. Metheny, initially housed on death row, was later transferred to the Western Correctional Institution, WCI, in Cumberland, Maryland, to serve his consolidated sentence. Life without parole for the murder of Kimberly Spicer, life for the murder of Kathy Ann Magaziner, and the 50-year sentence for the kidnapping and attempted sexual assault of Rita Kemper. His immense physical size, his history, and his self-cultivated reputation as the cannibal killer made him a figure of perpetual dark notoriety within the prison system. For over 2 decades, Metheny lived within the concrete walls of WCI, a permanent fixture of Maryland's prison system, forced into a monotonous routine that was the antithesis of the chaotic, violent freedom he had once enjoyed. His fate was sealed by his own horrific admissions, yet his existence was ultimately spared by a narrow, technical, but crucial legal distinction regarding the concept of a robbery afterthought. The decades Joseph Metheny spent incarcerated at the Western Correctional Institution, WCI, in Cumberland, Maryland, were a silent, monotonous contrast to the chaotic, violent life he had led on the outside. The death sentence, once a possibility, became a certainty of permanent confinement. Life without the possibility of parole. The killer who sought power, dominance, and the thrill of murder was reduced to the routine of an obese, aging inmate. During his time behind bars, Metheny occasionally resurfaced in the public eye, primarily through correspondence or interviews with true crime documentarians. He maintained his terrifying persona, frequently referencing his unconfirmed crimes and the sensational cannibalism claims. He seemed to relish the role of the monster, understanding that this narrative was the only power he had left, the power to terrorize a community and ensure his own continued infamy. However, the reality of his confinement was far less dramatic than the legend he cultivated. Metheny's massive physical size and long history of addiction led to increasingly severe health problems. Prison records do not detail the specifics of his ailments, but his size alone, coupled with a sedentary life, contributed to a predictable decline. The end for Joseph Roy Metheny came swiftly and quietly. On Saturday, August 5th, 2017, correctional officers at the Western Correctional Institution found the 62-year-old killer unresponsive inside his cell. He was pronounced dead at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The official cause of death was determined to be natural causes, an anticlimactic, silent end for a man who had ended the lives of others with such brutal violence. Metheny's death closed the final legal chapter on his life, but it did nothing to resolve the vast, open-ended trauma he left behind. The enduring legacy of the Joseph Metheny case is defined by the unanswered questions and the lives he confessed to taking, yet for whom no evidence was ever found. The full body count. Did Metheny truly kill up to 12 people? The murders of Randall Brewer, Randy Biker, and Tony Lynn Incracia remain unprosecutable convictions, and the lives of the three women he claimed to have thrown into the Patapsco River are permanently lost secrets, submerged in the cold water and the vast silence of the Chesapeake Bay area. The cannibalism claim. Was the roadside barbecue a genuine act of macabre horror, or a final, masterful manipulation designed to ensure his infamy? Since no corroborating evidence was ever found, Metheny took the definitive truth of this claim with him to the grave. Speculation, the psychological damage inflicted by the possibility, remains a permanent stain on Baltimore's history. The most profound impact of the case remains focused on the vulnerability of the victims. Metheny's entire criminal career was a cold, calculated exploitation of society's most marginalized, those battling addiction, experiencing homelessness, and engaged in sex work. Their anonymity and the lack of immediate, aggressive reporting of their disappearances allowed him to operate for years. The lives of Kathy Ann Magaziner and Kimberly Lynn Spicer, tragically cut short, and the heroic resistance and survival of Rita Kemper, serve as the only confirmed realities of the monster Metheny became. The silence that descended upon Joseph Roy Metheny in his prison cell on August 5, 2017, was the final, profound quiet after years of self-confessed violence. He died as he lived for 2 decades, confined, alone, and holding the final, terrifying secrets of a devastating, monstrous life. That concludes our extensive chronicle of Joseph Roy Metheny. If you appreciated the depth of research and the comprehensive narrative dedicated to telling the full, tragic story of this case, please consider supporting the channel by hitting the like button. Your support is essential and helps us continue to provide this meticulous level of detail. Also, be sure to subscribe and turn on all notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into the world's most compelling mysteries and true crime cases. Thank you for listening, and please, be safe out there.